Next thing I want to talk about as we walk through the book on page 3, there's a list of arguments presented for and against creating agricultural policy. Read through that list. Browse through it. It's worth your time to browse through. I'm not going to read it to you here because that's boring and you know how to read. I do want you to read the book, so I want to highlight that and make sure you're reading it. The important thing that I really want to talk about in chapter 1 is this discussion, the different perspectives that people might approach when they look at policy and attempt to decide what policies we should or should not have. There's a list of those. It's on page 4 in the textbook. First one is the free marketer. I don't like that word marketer. I'm going to change that title. Instead of free marketer, I'm going to put in the word liberal. And you're going, free market, liberal, what? Okay. So the word liberal does not mean what you think it means. For some reason in the United States, the word liberal has been associated with Democrats, with the political left. If you drop back and look at the world globally, if you were to go into Europe, the word liberal means more like someone who wants free markets. That word liberal really kind of means libertarian. Another word you might hear thrown about is a neoliberal. Neo means new, a new liberal. So Ronald Reagan was and Margaret Thatcher were people who were considered neoliberals. The neoliberals were people who thought that we should be opening up trade, opening up markets, and take advantage of some fundamentals of economics that are well known that will make the world a better place. And we can talk about the impact of all that at some point if you want to talk about it in the classroom, of course. So there's the free marketer, right? This is the person who believes that if you leave people to take their resources, right? They believe, right? The libertarians, the liberals, the free marketers, they love to say that they're practicing positive economics, but they're practicing normative economics. Now, whether or not the facts back them up or not, we're going to have a chance to talk about that later, okay? But they believe that the solution is free market. If you just let people do what they want to do, they will make the best possible choice. I'm going to take a little rewind back here. I'm going to go back to the very first economist who would not have identified himself as an economist because there were no economists at the time, Adam Smith. Adam Smith said, a very famous quote, that the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, and I'm paraphrasing from here on, do not provide your dinner because they like you, because they're interested in helping you out. They do it because they're looking out for their own self-interest. They have their own families to feed. Adam Smith argued that if you will let people have freedom and have property ownership, be able to own a butcher shop and make decisions with their resources and their time, that they will be guided as if by an invisible hand to do what is best for society. And that is the free market that Adam Smith envisioned. And so the belief here is that if we just sit back and just let things go, things are going to work out just fine. So that's the notion behind the free marketer, right? The person who thinks that we should be just kind of letting people alone to make their own decisions. And these individuals have some really good points. So the United States grows an absurdly large amount of corn. Why do we grow so much corn? Well, we can talk about that, and we'll spend some time focusing on that this semester. But the reality is that since the Great Depression, since World War II, the United States has heavily encouraged farmers to grow corn with a system of policy interventions. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll talk about that. That's what we're going to cover in a policy class. But the free marketer looks at that and says, why do we need this much corn? What's the purpose of it? Maybe if we didn't do this, farmers would be better off financially and we wouldn't have all this corn. So we'll get back to that, right? We'll talk a lot about that. All right, the next one is the humanitarian, right? The humanitarian. This humanitarian basically says that food is a right, right? People have a right to food. When we start talking about what's a right, what rights do people have, we are 100% in the realm of normative economics. I don't know that there's any scientifically valid way to prove what rights human beings have and don't have or should not have. I don't like calling them humanitarians. I like to call them egalitarians. So egalitarians want people to live in a fair world. And this kind of harkens back to one of the driving questions behind the early days of economics. If you look at some of the very early economists, people like Smith, there's this question: do people have the right to bread? What is the appropriate price for bread? Should bread be free? Well, you need bread to live, and so if someone doesn't have bread, you're in essence killing them. So maybe we should give people bread. But the problem is that bread takes resources to make. What about the person who made the bread? The person who made the bread had to buy the wheat, had to put all this work into turning the wheat into bread. What about them? Don't they need to survive as well? This is an important thing to remember about policy. Policy can help one person and hurt somebody else. So there's a lot of things with that egalitarian worldview that we can talk about and discuss. Oh, hey, you want people to starve, Dr. Gardner. That's why you're against this. It's all like, well, no, I don't want people to starve. I'm not against giving people who need food. To assume that I want people to starve because I see problems with the egalitarian approach is assuming that I'm evil. That's one of the rules we've got here. We can't assume anybody is evil. So we can't look at an egalitarian approach and say the person who's egalitarian is good and the person who says, oh, there's problems with that is not bad. They're just people who are trying to sort things out. And you can't sort things out when you insult people. So the next group that or the next perspective that the book lists is the Physiocratic Perspective. I like talking about physiocrats. I find them to be very, very hilarious. They're quite funny. The basic Physiocratic perspective follows this line of reasoning. And we mentioned Jefferson before and the Jeffersonian ideal. Jefferson was definitely a physiocrat. Here's the logic. The basic premise of the physiocrats is that all wealth comes from land. Period. Right? I've had this, I mentioned my dad in a previous lecture how he read some Jefferson and saw that Jefferson kind of made that physiocratic claim that all wealth comes from the land. We can talk about that. We can talk about where wealth comes from, and we'll have a discussion about that in a later video. It's definitely something we need to talk about. All wealth comes from the land. That's the physiocratic worldview. And as such, agriculture should be placed at high and primary importance. Yeah, when I say that in front of a room of agriculture students, they're all like, yeah, go agriculture, right? They love this physiocratic idea. We love the physiocratic idea. I own some land. I'm recording this in my house right now. Sure, it's a nifty idea. But when you roll back in time a little bit and look at the physiocrats, ask who they are, ask what they were up to, things start to look a little bit different. So the physiocrats were French, and I talked about Adam Smith earlier as being the first economist, but Adam Smith spent some quality time in France, and when he was there, he spent some time hanging out with some physiocrats. And a lot of the economics that Smith presented in his book about economics, The Wealth of Nations, right? It was a study into what makes a nation wealthy. Where does the wealth of a nation come from? An inquiry into the causes and sources of the wealth of nations. It's got a big long name to it. So Smith was influenced by these physiocrats. And really, we talk about Smith being the first economist. The physiocrats were probably the first people actually doing what we might consider economic analysis in these days. And here was the physiocrat logic. All wealth comes from the land. Therefore, if you need to tax things in order to have money to run the government, you should tax it at the direct source of the wealth, the land. This means that only landowners should be paying taxes. So you farmers out there with land, you liking this physiocrat idea now? Maybe it's not so good, right? Then they argue the only people who should have a say in government are the people who pay taxes. So their argument was really self-serving. Their argument was one of those arguments that's a bad argument because it is not falsifiable. What do I mean by that? Well, when you have a debate with the physiocrat, they'll say, you see that house was made out of wood that was grown on land. So that house was, in their mind, literally grown out of the land. And the only reason why it exists is because it came out of the land. They'll look at a computer and say, everything in that computer, the plastic came from oil, which came from the land. The copper inside the computer came from copper ore, which came from the land. We wouldn't have anything if we didn't have land to get it out of. And that's one of those arguments that's like, It's kind of silly because they can always say, well, yeah, and where did that come from? The land, right? Ah, gotcha. I don't buy arguments like that. Those kind of arguments just don't work with me. So next on the list is the stabilizer, right? So the stabilizer believes that the free market carries too much risk, that prices go up, prices go down. The economy's growing, the economy's in a recession. And the stabilizer believes that government should interfere in an attempt to make the markets more stable so that the highs and the lows in the market aren't there anymore. So they're looking at things like, hey, there's going to be bad weather, and that bad weather is going to cause yield to drop, and the farmer is going to be poor because of that. And so they believe that, in essence, the government should be stepping in order to catch people when they fall. These are the people who like the idea that government should be providing a safety net for people. So it's really the safety net argument. Take out the highs, take out the lows, and just truck along in the middle. That's the stabilizer viewpoint. And then finally, we have the regulator, right? The regulator thinks that the market needs to be coordinated. And you see a lot of this regulator language inside of our agricultural policy. I've mentioned before the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is the great big giant bundle of laws that the government passes that regulates agriculture. And so if you start looking at the Farm Bill, you'll see this regulator attitude in here where we're trying to make markets orderly, where we're trying to set things up so they go smoothly. If we just pass enough rules, things will work out. These are the people who decided that there should be a specific legal definition of milk. That's what we're talking about here. There's a common thing we see pop up in the Farm Bill called a marketing order. And marketing orders are basically these rules that are put together that create a little bit of, really they create stability. I really kind of think the stabilizer and the regulator are really kind of one and the same. They believe that we can go in and we can kind of tinker with the marketplace a little bit, and we can change this and change that and make a few little rules, have some little safety nets, and we can make the world a better place. A great example of a marketing order is a Vidalia onion. Have you heard of a Vidalia onion? Well, a Vidalia onion is just an onion that's grown in this geographic area that is specified by the law that created the Vidalia onion. It's just a sweet white onion. There's really nothing special about it. Allegedly, there's something in the soil, I think it's sulfur or something, or it's low sulfur soil or high sulfur, I don't know, that makes the onion better. But what makes a Vidalia onion better is a law that says if it came from this area, it's a Vidalia onion. And that is done allegedly in order to coordinate the market and regulate the market so that I can't grow an onion outside of the area and say, hey, look, I grew a Vidalia onion. Well, no, technically it's not a Vidalia onion. It didn't come from this region that we specified in the law. That's the kind of thing that pops up in there. These are laws that are aimed at organizing markets, having orderly markets. Hopefully we'll have time to cover some of these marketing orders. They're really interesting little bits of legislation.